Kemi Badenoch is famously late to everything, to meetings, to her own leadership announcement speech in 2022 because she was getting a aide to Deliveroo her a McDonald's in perhaps the most UK behaviour ever recorded. And it seems to political trends because her tactic of watchful waiting, of refusing to commit to a single policy because she's apparently working out the difficult details of policy behind the scenes, just isn't working. And the Conservative establishment, their friendly press, and even her own MPs are realising it and briefing against her. And it looks like for Kemi Badenoch, time is up. And we have a amusing history of her being called Laternoch or turning up 45 minutes late to meetings and then judging everyone else for being early, as documented in her unlicensed biography by Lord Ashcroft. There are criticisms of her when she used to work at The Spectator, saying that things were her top priority before leaving them unfinished. And there seems to be a recurring pattern here of Kemi being elevated beyond all reasonable expectations of the Peter Principle's ceiling on her ability to exceed, but also that she just doesn't deliver the goods as is promised. Mike Jones, who was one of her supporters, who's an excellent critic of migration policy, wrote in The Critic recently that she seems to have bought her own mythology as the second coming of Margaret Thatcher, but with diversity body armor. And that belief in herself as something akin to Daenerys Targaryen, who she says that she admires, means that she genuinely thinks she is the heir apparent to the right, and so that she's got it in the bag, and is either not amenable to advice to the contrary, or her own advisors, like Lee Rowley, are refusing to give her bad news and will only deliver her praise, which is inflating her sense of self-importance beyond all reason. And so, this sort of lateness to briefings has become so endemic that it actually became a source of humour, because during the Afghan scandal, where the last treacherous Conservative government took out multiple super injunctions to block from public knowledge the fact that they, due to an email leak from the Ministry of Defence, were secretly importing thousands of Afghans, including Taliban fighters, corrupt former government officials and sex offenders, at a cost of at least £7 billion to the British public, by the way. Kemi didn't know about this because she was offered a security briefing in March where she would have been told about the leak and the imminent lifting of the super injunction, but she actually didn't attend because she was late. And so sometimes being late can be her saving grace, but, well, turns out that her being too late to the rapid movement of politics from her position, which is essentially British values integration platitudes, a vague promise to control migration, and the need to feed all of one's arguments for the preservation of one's own nation through the mouth of someone with intersectional credentials, even if you're on the right. That position has been entirely left behind. It's the politics of 2010 and we're in 2025. And it shows that she really doesn't know what time it is, based on her recent reshuffle, where she promoted former leadership rival, former Home Secretary, and the most improperly named man in the world, James Cleverly, to the position of Shadow Minister for Housing, Levelling Up and Communities, Michael Gove's former role, so he can spar toe-to-toe with Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner. And this is very much the case of keeping your friends close but your enemies closer, because James Cleverly is favoured as the leadership rival by the Conservative establishment, who are still addicted to having, as Neil Ferguson told me at ARC, the case for integration be made to millions of unassimilable foreign nationals that they themselves brought in by a half or fully immigrant heritage or first-generation immigrant politician, like Kemi Badenoch or James Cleverly. They just want all of their positions to be repeated back to them by a black politician so that they don't feel white guilt about loving their own country. And I'm sorry, but the electorate are not only aging past you, because had the Conservative Party waited another 6 months to call the election by the deadline, 0.5% of their voter base would have just died off, but also discourse is moving so fast that the establishment Conservative position is unpopular and untenable. It is not only to blame for bringing Britain to the brink of civil unrest, economic ruin, and cultural disintegration, but also doesn't offer any sufficient solutions. It says, we just need stronger integration strategies. Okay, they haven't integrated. Now what? No answer. And so James Cleverly represents the Tory party that is to blame for mass migration, multiculturalism, the Afghan scandal, lockdown, the Online Safety Act, fiscal irresponsibility, all of these problems. But also, he has no contrition for the problems and no solutions. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that James Cleverly, when Kemi Badenoch was elected as the leader of the Conservative Party, tweeted out, "Labour are too pale, male and stale," showing his dripping contempt for the native population of this country. Here's the post in question, and I wonder if Cleverly has forgiven me for that particularly brutal ratio I gave. There should be no politician calling themselves conservative that speaks like this, that has such animus towards not only your own voters, but the native host majority, of which you are meant to be half, by the way, James, because your mother is English. What are you conserving if not the people of these isles from which the culture, the prosperity, the families, and the country flow? Nothing. Which is why the Conservative Party is in ruins. It is now being outnumbered in the polling by Reform UK. It was delivered a kicking at the last round of local elections, and they're gritting their teeth so hard that you could line the roads with them for next May's round of local elections when they're expected to lose even more, and wondering whether to get rid of Kemi in November when they have the numbers, or after they've been sufficiently decimated in May, because they'll even have even more of a mandate to remake the party in a revolutionary image, if there's barely anything left of it. CCHQ is empty. They're boasting about donors, but that's just because they want to keep the Carlton Club alive before they have to sell off the furniture as firewood. The Conservative Party's got nothing left, and imagine electing James Cleverly. But what's even more telling is in the reshuffle, and this is not detailed as much in the Financial Times piece, but it is in other pieces, is that she has changed out people behind the scenes. So she has gotten rid of Lee Rowley, who was her former closest advisor. It's been replaced by Henry Newman. Now, Henry Newman is a former special advisor to Michael Gove and to Francis Maude, who was the party chairman for David Cameron and Michael Gove, before Baroness Saida Vorsi, who obviously accused her own party of Islamophobia and is now constantly complaining that the entire country hates Muslims. By the by, the majority of the British public polled last week found them in favour of saying Islam is incompatible with British values. I would just say British traditions, because values can change, whereas traditions are a long and unbroken chain that stems from a particular people. But whether the wording is correct, they're right on instinct. Warsi is wrong. And the modernisers, as they call themselves, or the Cameroonians of the Conservative Party, that decided, again, like Cleverly, the party was too pale, male and stale. They needed all women and all minority shortlists that packed the party full of inveterate wets and incompetents like Priti Patel. Those people who destroyed the party just because they didn't like the fact that Theresa May had pointed out they were being called the nasty party and they wanted to be liked by The Guardian, or as Dominic Cummings said infamously of Boris Johnson, he opened the floodgates to post-Brexit migration because he, quote, wanted the Financial Times to like him again. Those people have been utterly repudiated by the electorate. They are being punished at the last election, at all of the local elections, and they are the reason for the rise of reform. And yet, Kemi Badenoch has brought this person, Henry Newman, in as her advisor. Now, he is also Carrie Johnson's friend and was called the chatty rat, a sort of confidant who had leaked to the press, by Dominic Cummings. And Dominic Cummings put out the following tweet, and I think this is the death blow to Kemi Badenoch's premiership, because Dominic Cummings, despite his Barnard Castle fiasco, has been looked to as a credible voice on the problems the Conservatives failed to address while in government. Now, anything Cummings says should be taken with a pillar of salt, because he is still friendly with Michael Gove. He is very much interested in rehabilitating Gove's image, while Gove is the editor of The Spectator now, and saying that Gove did the right thing, in all fairness, while at the Department of Education, and backing Andrew Norfolk at the Times to prevent a super injunction, blocking his reporting on the grooming gangs, and blocking the cover-up of child abuse that the Department for Education knew about. However, Cummings coming out and saying things as brutal as this tweet shows that the Tory party isn't keeping up the pretense that they have faith in Kemi winning in 2029 anymore. Neil Ferguson at ARC bet me on camera that Kemi Badenoch would be Prime Minister by 2029. I take checks, Neil. Anyway, Cummings tweeted about this reshuffle. Quote, great appointments by Kemi, I hate my Nigerian tribal rivals Badenoch, cleverly the last great defender of the Boris carry wave, proud defender of giving soldiers houses to Afghans, one of the architects with Boris of the disgraceful giveaway of Chagos, opponent of house building, loved by officials because he is pure NPC, will read out documents like the Chagos surrender with a straight face too, no questions ever asked, just say it's the legal advice minister and you can get him to say anything. Will fit in well with Kemi Badenoch's regime for its last few months. Also good to see Newman, pictured, standing alongside Keir Starmer at Camden Pride when Newman was a Camden Conservative councillor, is also super logical. One of those who worked with Carrie to support the mental trans rights Stonewall campaign, strengthen its grip on the Cabinet Office, co-campaigner with Starmer for Camden Pride, hope to see Wally, an advisor on national security, Carrie, an advisor on propriety and ethics, and one of the gay sex addict drug users in charge of family policy in this reshuffle. Dominic Cummings, in his own words, just called the Tory party the party of gay sex and stupidity. I think Kemi's cooked. You can't come back from that, I'm afraid. You're going to have to do a lot of explaining, but Kemi now has the aura of being in terminal decline, and especially because in the age of rising migration skepticism, on cultural, not just logistical grounds, a general pessimism about the prospect of integration, small fissures of difference will become reasons for distrust. Feeling like someone is incapable of representing you if they're different from you. And so appointing a woman who identifies as a first-generation immigrant and not British, not English, but Yoruba Nigerian for whom other Nigerians are her ethnic enemies is not, as was extolled by the likes of Charles Moore on the Telegraph, a boon to the Tory party, making her impervious to accusations of racism, which they levelled Labour at Swilla Braverman and Priti Patel anyway, so they're always going to call you racist no matter what. Instead, it's a liability for your own electorate, who just want to be led by an Englishman who is going to stop migration, and who does not have the baggage of throughout their career personally lobbying to lift the caps on student and study visas, as Kemi did in 2018. Now, Cummings expanded on his pessimism about Kemi in the following Substack post, and he writes, and he doesn't hold back, Kemi is lazy, brittle, and delusional, and he worked with her, remember, because he's good friends with Gove, who, Gove being Kemi's protege and has consistently pushed Kemi in her 2022 leadership bid, even as recently as arguing with Matt Goodwin that Kemi is to the right of Reform and Nigel Farage, which some Tory ministers might actually be to the right of Reform. I'm thinking Katie Lamb and Nick Timothy and even Robert Jenrick, in Farage's own words, but certainly not Kemi Badenoch. Kemi Badenoch uses stupid lefty white kids or white as a pejorative when addressing David Tennant. That's an ethnic animus that does not fly with a new younger right wing that Goodwin rightly points out is more concerned with questions of identity, belonging, and immigration than it is with the economic axis that was popular during the capitalism v socialism battles of the Cold War. Anyway, Cummings writes, Kemi is lazy, brittle, and delusional. In her previous jobs, she was useless but learned to blame others. She doesn't have any of the things needed for serious leader. The people who like her are A, people who've swallowed insider spin, or B, a subset of insider characters whose preferences and tastes are very far from the median voter. From all parts of the ideological spectrum, I hear identical lines. She won't listen to anybody. She picks fights with everybody. She meets a businessman who made a fortune in X and then explains why they're wrong about X. She's lazy and won't read. She sits in her office playing computer games on her iPad. She sees stuff on Twitter and just blurts it out. I can't see her developing in the job. Most spads and donors who created her did not work on her leadership contest because they got so disillusioned. People inside her inner circle are already telling friends, I can't see this working. Now, I actually did ask someone who had worked with Kemi whether or not this is true, and on the condition of anonymity, they gave me the following quote. Badenoch is a symptom of a hollowed-out Conservative Party. It's the end game of modernisers who care about optics over substance. They've killed the party. And they said that she didn't really read her briefs. And the very well-crafted speech by the likes of Munira Mirza against racist, anti-white racist DEI policies in 2021, in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution following the death of George Floyd and the BLM riots in America that swept over Britain, where a majority of Conservative ministers at the time in government took diversity training. So, again, inveterate wets and traitors. Kemi Badenoch's speech pushing back against that was designed to propel her to stardom, but she'd had lots of prep, She'd had most of the research work done for her, and because of her identity at the time, she was best positioned to make the case against black separatist, anti-white identity politics. But now the issue is immigration. Her status as an immigrant is a liability, and her unwillingness to do any work will always put her behind the rapidly moving discourse which is accelerated because of the nature of the internet. And so, let's cast our minds back to the promotion that Kemi was receiving by the likes of Tory gargoyles like Charles Moore, similar Tory gargoyles like William Hague, who are currently backing James Cleverly as her replacement option at the moment. But Charles Moore wrote at the time, although originating in the centre, Robert Jenrick is now the more programmatically right-wing of the two. This may be because his time as immigration minister convinced him of the fundamental uselessness of Tory policy on the subject, also because his family is Jewish, his wife is American-Israeli, and October the 7th was a real wake-up moment for him, as it was for Suella Braverman, because when you have Muslims chanting in the street every weekend and Wednesday, along with a bunch of communists, saying, globalize the intifada from the river to the sea, and praising a group in whose charter it has the genocide of all Jews, you might think your family have come under threat and your government has made a mistake. But, to continue, Moore writes, he became angry at his party's promises, which could not, in the present state of the law, be kept. The iron entered his soul. Emotionally, therefore, Mr. Jenrick is close to the sort of voter who defected to reform. While in office, he came to realise he was thinking what they were thinking. He can therefore claim that he would be the sort of Tory leader who could win such people back. I originally remember that he was saying he was going to deliver the policies of Nigel Farage with the candour of David Cameron. Instead, what he's doing is he's delivering the policies of Rupert Lowe with the presentation of Nigel Farage, which is very good. But again, Jenrick also carries with him the baggage of suspected insincerity. I think he's personally sincere, but lots of voters will think he's insincere. His conversion from voting for the previous assisted dying legislation in 2017, being communities minister during the Boris wave, supporting the lockdown, voting for the online safety bill, to then going to sceptical of Stella Creasy's abortion amendment, the Labour government's assisted dying bill, being a hardliner on immigration, being very tough on crime, speaking about anti-white racism and English identity. People will think, well, how rapid can that conversion be sincere? And also, and again, I like Jenrick and I like his team and the people around him. Doesn't he just give off the vibe of Ron DeSantis at the moment? He's not Trump, right? He's Ron DeSantis. He's a slightly autistic, very competent governor who really hates his political enemies, understands the existential threat that they present, and will have no bones about crushing them with forthright and moral legislation. Good on him. But does he have political pixie dust? He at least needs more time in the tank to work on his persona. His videos have been seismic. They've really impacted political discourse, and he's been the most forthright about this. But he isn't a Trump figure. Maybe we don't need a Trump figure, but I think the reason that Nigel Farage is, or at least has been, consuming a lot of media attention and is still topping the polls is because he at least occupies the vacant spot of a Trump figure in the public imagination, despite the increasing awareness online and in print of his softening on certain issues. And so, can Jenrick do that? We don't know. But we certainly know that Kemi can't do that. Charles Moore sold Kemi to us as, for her, Kemi, it is less a matter of party, more a set of beliefs. Because of her ethnic background, she has direct encounters with the hostile ideologies that divide Britain and other Western countries through identity and sexual politics, which set people against one another and weaken families. She has an immigrant patriotism for this country, an emotion often underrated by those of us brought up here. Her memorable, striking eloquence comes from this. In terms of personality, Mr. Jenrick is cool-headed and therefore potentially unresonant with the public, and Mrs. Badenoch is fiery and therefore potentially troublesome. Having no vote in this contest, I'm a non-affiliated peer, I look at it with some detachment. I would say that it would be unwise to overlook the obvious. A black African woman leading the oldest political party in the world would be a sight for sore eyes. The left's cant phrase in relation to racism, lived experience, would come back to bite them. Sir Keir, never eloquent, would be at loss for words. Unfortunately, Kemi has been trounced multiple times at P&Qs by Keir Starmer because she looks shaky and unprepared, and why would it be a sight for sore eyes to be led by a black African woman? I don't agree. I think, one, the most qualified candidate should have won the leadership election. I don't think Kemi was the more qualified candidate. But two, I think it's actually better for England to be led by English people. I think it's better for Nigeria to be led by Nigerians. I think it's better for the Japanese to be led by the Japanese. I think it's better for Israel to be led by Jews. I think it's better for pretty much every country to be led by its own people. And so I don't actually think that Kemi, who identifies as first-generation immigrant Yoruba, for whom it would be a slight liability to shut the borders to people who share her identity as an immigrant, I don't think that's a good idea. It's why she seemed hesitant in her trigonometry interview to put any country on a red list, because she left open the possibility that hypothetically there might be one rocket scientist from Pakistan that merits allowing in all of the grooming gang perpetrators. Because she herself sees herself as that exceptional individual from Nigeria, and so she doesn't want to exclude the possibility that exceptional individuals can come from certain countries, when, on pure probability, very rarely happens. So, it's a liability, not a strength. Actually, I remember Harrison Pitt wrote a piece at the time criticising this sort of line of thought from Charles Moore in the European Conservative. And he and I and Georgia Gilhooly and Stephen Edgington and Nick Dixon were all chastised as the very online right, which is just code for racist, for saying, well, do we think that Kemi is being overhyped? Do we think that actually this is a bad strategy to promote an immigrant to the top of your party at a time of immigrant skepticism? And the Tory old guard, like Francis Maude, who I mentioned before, who has been appointed one of Kemi's advisors now, despite leading the Cameron Conservative Party to ruin, along with the likes of Gove and Cameron, who are in Kemi's corner. We were saying, is it actually the best idea to do this? And we were derided and dismissed, but actually Harrison put it best when he said that Moore has been spellbound by this fantasy of being led by a black girl boss who the left can't call racist, even though they will call her racist, and so has overlooked her flaws and has now bet the entire house on Badenoch. And there are quite a few people also at the roulette table wondering if they should have put their money on red instead. And so these promises of moments of firebrand salience, of telling it like it is, haven't happened. They almost happened the other day, as I note with this GB News clip with Camilla Tominey, where Camilla asked about Starmer's then upcoming announcement that Labour were going to recognise an independent Palestinian state. And she asks, are you a Zionist? And Kemi, quite cleverly, said, I don't know what people mean by Zionist, because of course the term constantly shifts and moves and is very subjective, and brought the conversation back to the threat posed by global and also domestic Islamist terrorism to Britain. And she was doing really well until the very end, when she said, and this shows her poor instincts, that it is in particular bad for peaceful Muslims who just want to go about their lives. No, it isn't. Actually, said peaceful Muslims just have a doctrinal dispute with the core faith claims of Islam with their more devout, jihadist, closer reading brethren. It's actually way worse for the British public who don't want to live in a Muslim country in the first place. And if Kemi truly tells it like it is, and her immigrant heritage gives her this sort of sacred way of knowing that we ignorant Brits are inaccessible to, she would know from Nigeria and her ethnic enemies that actually Islam and Christianity cannot coexist, because Islam will never leave Christians alone. And instead, she still feels the need to buffer her arguments with this hypothetical under siege minority group who she is defending, rather than saying Islam is incompatible with British traditions, as the majority of the country think, and she can consider herself among our tribe if she likes, because she's married to Hamish Badenoch, who himself is Scottish, and so she has half-native children. She would say, this being our home, she keeps saying this is our home and not a hotel, we feel Islam is incompatible with Britain and we do not want it here. And we can defend our home on its own terms, not our home as a safe haven for these hypothetically moderate Muslims who don't really exist. I mean, the majority, again, it's 2/3 of British-born Muslims living in Britain think Hamas did nothing wrong on October the 7th. So this constituency doesn't exist. So who is Kemi representing? She is only representing the gargoyles of the Conservative Party who led the party and the country to ruin, who want their opinions repeated back to them by an articulate black politician. And it's just not the time for that. It's the wrong time. As Cummings says, Kemi just doesn't get it. She is appointing the wrong people. And this messaging, that she is Britain's Javier Milei, also won't cut it. For two reasons. One, your brand of fiscal chainsaw-wielding libertarianism doesn't include cutting the triple lock-on pensions and reassessing NHS spending, because you know that it is politically radioactive for the boomer donor and voting class, which is all the Conservative Party has left right now. So how much money can you actually cut? But also, purely fiscal concerns are not the concerns of the new right, as Matt Goodwin has written in his new policy exchange paper. So just talking about purely logistical and economic issues will not sate the appetites of people who are pessimistic about demographics, integration, and immigration. And so the only thing Kemi has is her immigrant identity, which itself is a liability. There's no getting around it. This is why I think her premiership is in terminal decline. And so you've now got pieces in The Spectator by a new writer, Tim Shipman, formerly of the Times, I believe, who's come over, who is being told by members of the Conservative Party and MPs that they're basically doomed. He's getting quotes, for example, from a shadow minister saying, the polls are absolutely horrific. Kemi's personal polling is in Liz Truss territory. There is no precedent for it. People say, let Kemi be Kemi, but there are increasingly few don't knows, and they are moving against us. We are being frozen out in the national conversation. There was another piece in The Spectator by Shipman on whether or not reform can be stopped, where he spoke to a CCHQ source who had said, the operation is a shit show. They had so little power and were sick of carrying the can for failure, which is why there are so many resignations. And another aide, apparently, said that during a focus group, Badenoch was described by one voter as repulsive. Again, it's right there in the Cummings tweet. This is just the vibe of the Tory party. It's corruption, sleaze, sexual impropriety, ignorance, and being responsible for bringing the country to the brink of ruin. And this is why this massive hit piece in the New Statesman by Will Lloyd, titled Kemi Badenoch Isn't Working, reminiscent of the Saatchi and Saatchi billboard Labour Isn't Working, which helped win Thatcher the election in 1979. This is why it's just full of quotes from Tory insiders. It's ruthless, frankly. Kemi would be doing better if she had hired Acme from Looney Tunes to conduct her PR and strategy for her. So there's a quote in here where it says, Richard Holden, the former party chairman, told a recent private dinner, according to one witness, that the shadow cabinet was full of non-entities, with his usual gift for gentle understatement. Dominic Cummings has called Badenoch lazy, brittle, and delusional. Meanwhile, Badenoch's preferred tactic has been to hide. Media appearances, never prolific, appear to have become even scarcer. According to those who have watched her operate up close, she has a habit of vanishing into her AirPods and iPad. Senior Tories complain that she is difficult to reach before 11 a.m. Her team says her working day starts early. She rarely leaves London to campaign in the regions. Asked on Westminster stages what her economic plan is, she talks instead about the social issues that fueled her rise, from gender clinics and trans people to a new concern, abortion, even though she's pro-choice. Evenings are spent doom-scrolling and making calls to editors and producers about trying to spike negative stories about her. Her husband Hamish absorbs the worst tweets, the ones she can't face. She is fragile and frightened. She's very bourgeois. She lives in the opinions of others. She's constantly trying to manage public perception, rather than getting out ahead of it and giving people a reason to have faith in her. Again, sign of terminal decline. Continue. At PMQs, Badenoch's hands shake when she reads her lines from a piece of paper. Her backbenchers notice. On television, when she rouses herself to appear in the studios, Badenoch blinks more than she used to. Her donors notice. This is someone not enjoying the job. And there was a part in here where apparently her old notebook was found, where she says that she believes that she is the standard bearer of the right. So she feels this crushing pressure to live up to the expectations placed on her by Fraser Nelson and Neil Ferguson and Michael Gove and Charles Moore and all of these Tory old guard establishment figures who have brought the country and the party to its knees. But she's not capable of living up to it privately, according to these sources, at least. It's just not working. And as for criticisms. I mean, Lloyd addresses criticisms from folks that are derided as the very online right, which, I mean, that criticism mainly comes from Spiked, but that's moronic, because one, they're spiked online, so they acknowledge the power of online discourse, which means that they just hate the right, so they're positioning themselves as the left. So why would any right-wing party, ostensibly right-wing party like the Conservatives, take their advice on anything? Because they're leftists. But also, it's stupid because pretty much everyone's totally online at this point, or is at least one sphere of separation removed from someone who sources all of their news and political opinions from being online. And the amount of people I speak who work in Westminster, in influential think tanks, in MPs' offices, in pressure groups, who watch this show, even some of the clips that YouTube suppresses in the algorithm, and will talk to me about it, and say that they like my commentary and my writing, is important. So yeah, it doesn't just stay online. The maximum proof that it's not just a niche, very online right is, one, that Kemi Badenoch is allowing mean tweets to get to her, but two, the fact that an argument between Sam Bidwell and Fraser Nelson about his Telegraph column then led to Max Tempers, an anonymous account, posting a transcript from the Oxford grooming gang trial on Twitter, which then caught the attention of Elon Musk, which then dictated British politics to be focused for about a solid 6 months on whether or not there's going to be a national grooming gang inquiry. This scandal's gone on for decades, and it took a few tweets to finally get some movement on it after the tireless work of the likes of Andrew Norfolk and Charlie Peters and all sorts of other people. So it's not confined to the online space. But anyway, Will observes in this New Statesman piece, in a common parlance, I use the latter and not the former. It is this ungoverned space that hostility to Badenoch takes on a distinctly racialised tinge. I disagree with that. Her Nigerian heritage, once thought by Tory modernisers to be a strength, is now seen by young right-wing types as a weakness, especially as her party struggles to keep up with reform on illegal immigration and asylum. Their criticisms are beginning to be echoed by older right-wingers, such as Matt Goodwin, for example. More dangerous still to Badenoch's prospects is a very specific charge. It is said that she is failing to press home political attacks on the small boats crisis because she is worried it will invite scrutiny of the way her parents got her citizenship. The accusation that Badenoch is an anchor baby, a term that refers to the children of foreign nationals exploiting just solely citizenship laws, being born on soil makes you a citizen of that country. That her parents took advantage of British citizenship laws in the early 1980s to get their daughter a passport, has circulated for some time on the fringes of Tory and media circles and been denied in the past by Badenoch. I don't see how any other way of interpreting her parents coming from Nigeria to use the NHS to give birth to her, then returning to Nigeria, living in Nigeria and the US, and then sending her to study engineering as a teenager in Britain because she has British citizenship. I don't see any other way of interpreting that other than health tourism. It's the elephant in the room, said one source regarding the way Badenoch got her British citizenship. They compared Badenoch's parents, in crude terms, to small boat migrants crossing the Channel. Listening to them attack Badenoch in private, it becomes clear that for some Conservatives, Badenoch is a proxy for their fears about migration, and worse. There's a clear strain of racism in the remarks. How? How is it racism? Are they saying that she's inferior because she's black? No. They are saying that having a first-generation immigrant who doesn't identify as British but identifies as ethnically Yoruba, with ethnic Nigerian enemies, which if she became Prime Minister might have a bearing on domestic policy because we've imported so many Nigerians, but also international policy. We've got to worry about terror attacks from Boko Haram. That is all a very salient concern. And also it's a matter of representation, because if she doesn't identify as English, because she can't, or as primarily British, and if her being the beneficiary of Britain's opportunities and meeting her husband and having her children was only enabled by a permissive birthright citizenship scheme that was scrapped the year after she was born here, I don't see how any of that has to do with her race. I see all of that as being to do with her immigrant heritage being a liability and influencing the way she is governing in an age of migration skepticism. So this is just bad faith smears. But it says, they cringe when she asserts that her ascent from Nigeria to Tory leadership is proof that Britain still works. Yeah, because the premise is, if she wasn't Tory leader, Britain would be racist. Worse, they find it offensive. Britain doesn't work, that's the problem. And also, Britain would be fine without Kemi Badenoch here. Britain would be fine without any immigrant here. Britain was fine for generations. And given immigrants, I've met some of them, plenty of people that I know interpersonally. Given immigrants may themselves be nice people. We may actually want them here. But that doesn't mean that they need to be here for Britain to be a good country. And that is the premise in Kemi's statement. Britain is a good country, and the proof is that I've succeeded. No, Britain would be a good country whether or not Kemi Badenoch has succeeded. And the problem is, she isn't succeeding. And Lloyd quotes, while the idea of Olukemi Olufunto Adegoke Badenoch was always deeply seductive to a certain kind of Tory, the former academic and reform mouthpiece Matt Goodwin wrote in February, Matt supports reform, shock, unsubtly implying that Badenoch is not British by using her full name. She's not. She's British by citizenship, but she's Yoruba Nigerian. The idea of Kemi Badenoch is definitely not igniting the same reaction out there in the wider country, Matt writes. The optimism that marked an older generation of Conservatives like Fraser Nelson and boosterish Tory leaders like Johnson has given way in certain parts of the right to an astral pessimism about Britain, its demographics and its future. Yeah, it's called growing up in the Britain that they created. There is a deep pathos to Badenoch's slow-motion retreat into herself, refusing to face the reality of her position. And don't get me wrong, I feel sad that she is saddened by attacks online, but that just means she's not a cut out for the job, I'm afraid. She tries to keep everyone together and they stab her in the back, says her former staffer. You think you belong, you think you're attached to this institution, but it's full of backstabbers. According to this former staffer, Badenoch does not think the criticism directed at her is racist. Well, fair on her. She's far more sensible than Will Lloyd is in this piece. After all, if the Conservative Party was racist, how could she have ended up leading it? And the country, broadly, doesn't just hate people arbitrarily because of their skin colour, but they do see, as a fact, her immigrant heritage being a liability and an impediment to her being willing to draw up the drawbridge to future immigrants. And so I thought I'd finish on this, because shortly before Kemi Badenoch took over the party, while she was heading up Shadow Cabinet, while she was actually delivering the first Shadow Cabinet briefing, which was then leaked to the Times, where she called Suella Braverman the victim of a very public mental breakdown, I was kicked out of the Conservative Party. Mainly because I had opposed child gender transition. I had two other posts, one where I said before I was a member of the Conservative Party that I voted for reform in a local by-election, and the other because I said that reform, Lee Anderson should not have been kicked out of the Conservative Party and forced to defect to reform for criticising Sadiq Khan because Sadiq Khan made an entire legal career out of defending Islamic terrorists. However, the main reasons I was kicked out was because I opposed child gender transition and said the LGBTQ community is not family friendly because they can't reproduce without reproductive technologies that inflict injustices on children who can't choose their parents, and they have sterilized thousands of children in the name of a lie that you could change sex. So even though that's Kemi's position, I was kicked out of the party for that. And so I would just like to point out that most political commentary ages like milk, right? And that's fine, because it is necessary for the transient conditions under which observations are made. And all political commentary is, yes, a description of reality, but it is also an attempt to encourage or discourage certain policies or talking points. And so, political commentary has less permanence than philosophy, which ages like wine. However, this piece has aged like the wine in the Carlton Club cellar. I had planned to write an article evaluating the merits and faults of each prospective leadership candidate, but whoever holds the crossbar puppeteering the corpse of that former election-winning institution is now irrelevant. If the Conservative Party is incapable of accommodating critics of its disastrous record in government, then it demonstrates its commitment to continuing the very status quo which delivered the worst, well-deserved election defeat for a century. The fact that the Conservative Party uses the ever-expanding LGBT acronym explains why it cannot mount at events against its Labour, Lib Dem and Green counterparts. If not the innocence of children and the most basic biological distinction between the sexes, what on earth are the Conservatives in the business of conserving exactly? It certainly isn't the native host population of the country and their culture if they think that the likes of James Cleverly or Kemi Badenoch are the answer to a public that punished them for not being sufficiently restrictionist enough on migration. How is the Conservative Party in such disarray that its government commissioned and implemented the findings of the Cass Review, but its party apparatchiks expel members like me, who have a career history of being consistently right on this issue years before the review was published? The Conservative Party seems intent on following Tony Blair's revolutionary on-rails way of doing politics until it careens off a cliff. They've reached Soviet levels of incapacity for self-reflection. They insist on abusive relationship with their base, breaking manifesto pledges, making unforced errors while campaigning, and engaging in blatant corruption while commanding ceaseless loyalty from disappointed supporters. If you point at the naked emperor, you are punished as if you stole his garments. I am unbothered by who chooses to drink from the poison chalice come the 2nd of November 2024, when the party will formally pick its leader. Recent convert to the blindingly obvious Robert Jenrick seems sincere, but forces in the Kemi corner seek to stop the faction, looking to recoup losses from reform, and instead insist on continuing the Cameron consensus. Those looking to make the party a viable electoral prospect would do well to ignore the one nation wets, blaming the loss on being insufficiently centrist. Reform UK has begun to understand that to bend the knee is to stoop to the height of the headsman's axe, but the Conservatives continue to run in circles like decapitated chickens, bereft of principles except doing all they can to avoid offending their opponents. So, where do the Conservative Party go next? Well, could be Robert Jenrick, but, as already mentioned, he has a lot of work to do to offload the baggage of the last 14 years of disastrous Conservative government. Newcomers like Katie Lamb are still too fresh-faced. Frankly, the party is like a business entering an insolvency period. So what usually happens when businesses do go bust? Well, another company comes in to acquire it. They appoint an emergency CEO who gets things in order. I think, and it's not beyond the realm of possibility, depending on how desperate they get, the Conservatives' only chance is to just appoint Rupert Lowe leader. I think the voter base will go along with it. I think he's the brightest mind in Parliament right now. He's apparently the most far right, according to Hope Not Hate, which is a ringing endorsement given the widespread popularity of his positions with the voting public. Whether or not the Conservatives will be wise enough to do that, we'll see. But whether it's Jenrick or Lowe, pretty much everyone, including in Kemi's former camp, are concluding that Badenoch's time is up.